So Addison introduced me, and I'm actually here to introduce our speaker this morning. But just a little bit more. My husband David and I moved to Lexington. Now we live in Nicholasville, Kentucky in January of 2020, just prior to getting shut in by COVID. But we were blessed during those difficult months to meet Martin Brooks, who is the president of PeaceCatalyst International. Martin is with us here today. And so we met Martin, and at that time I had heard about PeaceCatalyst for a number of years. And when we moved here to Kentucky, I knew that I was just steps away from Louisville. So I was so excited to affiliate with PeaceCatalyst International. David and I have had a desire to build relationships with Muslims for many, many years. Living where we did in South Carolina, we didn't have a ton of opportunities to do that. So when David's job brought us here to Kentucky and to Lexington, we knew that this was a much more diverse community and that those opportunities were going to come our way. So they did, both with Christian Muslim Dialogue and with PeaceCatalyst. So I've been on the volunteer staff of PeaceCatalyst International since early in 2020. And it is my hope that after we hear Martin today, that our two organizations can collaborate together to continue this peace building effort. And one of the things Martin is going to tell you about today is the idea of peace feasts, which are meals that Christians and Muslims or others have together in a very relaxed way, usually in the evening, where we can have time to dialogue and get to know each other in a very enjoyable manner. But let me introduce Martin Brooks to you. As I said, it is a privilege to do this. Martin and his wife, Susan, have been with PeaceCatalyst International since 2011. They returned at that time from living in Turkish Cyprus. Martin has a master's degree in international relations from Near East University, and he has lived in a multitude of countries: Portugal, Mozambique, Ghana, Turkish Cyprus, and has overseen missions, relief, and development projects in places like Afghanistan and Bosnia, Mozambique, Morocco, South Sudan, Tanzania. So with PeaceCatalyst, and as Martin will explain, we draw upon the examples of Jesus. Martin also works with local organizations and local churches. And as I said, will talk to us about hosting dialogue events. He's hosted peace feasts and iftars. He's done that with Palestinians and Syrians and Turks. Yes, he is a gifted collaborator for sure. Of late, Martin has collaborated with, I don't know if this name is familiar to you, Miroslav Volf of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. So with all of these collaborative efforts and with his experience, we want to welcome the president of PeaceCatalyst. But before Martin comes up, I don't want to miss out on the most important thing I want to say about you, Martin. And that is, he and Susan have 10 grandchildren. Count them, 10. And a couple of grand dogs as well. So thank you so much for coming to be with us from Louisville this morning. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hi, I'm Martin Brooks, and it's just a pleasure to be here with you today and to share a little bit about PeaceCatalyst and the work that we've done. I mean, who can look at what's going on in our nation and the world and not wonder what's going on and what can we do about it? How can we contribute to something that's positive? something that leads our country, leads our world, leads our religious expressions of faith, and even in our own spirit. You know, when we are distraught and worried about life and the situations around us, we watch the news and we see the shootings that are going on, the racial tension that's going on. We see the stereotypes that we know aren't accurate, but somehow it just seems like we're hardwired. People are hardwired to protect themselves, to think in terms of my identity, and as we collect into groups, it becomes my group against the other group. How do we resist all of that? So PeaceCatalyst was born in 2009 by my predecessor, a man named Rick Love. Great name for a peacemaker, huh? Rick passed away in 2019, but before that, he had been the international director of a mission, an evangelical missionary organization called Frontiers Missions. And Frontiers Missions has people in probably, has about, last I remember, 1,200 people, missionaries, exclusively in Muslim countries. And Rick was leading this organization. So as we think about the evangelical movement, the emphasis in trying to convert people from one group to another, Rick began to question how we were relating to the other. And the questions arose: how can we be true to our own faith and yet totally respectful of other people and invite them into our joy that we find, but also learn from people who think differently than us? Rick was teaching a class at Columbia University. It's not the big Columbia University in New York, but a smaller one in South Carolina. And he had a reporter that was sitting in the class from Mother Jones magazine out of California. And they knew the reporter was there. The reporter was interviewing the different students in the class. Rick was teaching the class on an adjunct basis. And when the article came out, it was very negative. On the cover of the magazine, there was a woman that was in a burqa. You could only see the eyes, and the title said "The Stealth Crusade." And what it was talking about was missionaries that would go into countries and say, well, I'm here to teach English, or I'm here to run a humanitarian project, or I'm here working in some business. But really, there was a hidden agenda. And the agenda was to convert Muslims to Christianity. And the writer of this article called out the evangelical, particularly the evangelical, but the Christian community at large, for this somewhat deceitful, or very deceitful practice. And Rick began to think, is there a different way that we can relate to Muslims in a more integrous way? And he came up with this concept he called being 3D. So it's like, whoever you're talking to, you should be able to say who you are. If you're Muslim, you're Muslim. If you're Christian, you're Christian. If you're talking to someone who's supporting your work, you should be able to say the same thing that you would say if you were talking to someone who to somebody from a different faith tradition, or a government person, or a business person. That's just a matter of integrity. And there are elements within the missionary world that don't do that. And that became a problem to Rick. Rick ended up resigning from Frontiers, and he did some postdoc work at Yale. Lisa mentioned Miroslav Volf was one of the attractors of Yale. At that time, Prince Ghazi of Jordan wrote an open letter to the churches, and it was called the Common Word. I don't know if any of you may have heard of this document, but it essentially said, the Muslim world, Islam teaches that there's one God, and that we should love God and love our neighbors, our fellow man. Christianity teaches the same thing, that there's one God, and we're trying to figure out how to relate to this God, and that we should love our neighbor. So love God, love your neighbor. Both religions have this in common. Can we build on that foundation? Now that letter was written in about 2007. So we're in a post 9/11 world when much of the West, much of the US being the world's only superpower at that point in time, was using its military muscle in 2 different Muslim countries and, around the world. So Prince Ghazi was saying, what's a better way? How can we resolve some of these misunderstandings and work together? Rick, being at Yale, helped coordinate a response to that and brought in Islamic scholars from around the world, and Christian scholars from around the world. And they began to discuss how to resolve some of these things. PeaceCatalyst was born just after that. So that whole philosophy of how do we work together, find common ground to work together so that everyone can thrive, was sort of the foundation of PeaceCatalyst. My personal journey mirrored that a little bit. I had been a missionary, first in Mozambique, then in Ghana, then we went to Turkish Cyprus. And as I was preparing to be a missionary in a Muslim country, a very secular Muslim country, Turkish Cyprus, I had read all of the books that Christians had written about Muslims. And here's what Muslims believe, so I'm reading in this bubble of Christian thought about Islam. And when I actually met Muslims, I realized that what I had read had been biased, not necessarily untrue in many cases, but I mean there was untruths there too, or to be gracious, let's say misunderstandings there. But when I actually met my Muslim friends, became friends with Muslims, it changed the way that I perceived Islam, Muslim people, and I think more importantly, Christianity. Because some of the things that I had been taught within the circles that I fellowshiped with, ran, supported me, were inaccurate. So I came back to the US and said to my churches that were supporting this missionary effort, we need to rethink how we're approaching Muslims, because some of the things that we've been told just aren't right. That got me defunded. I lost probably 2/3 of my support in that transition to PeaceCatalyst. PeaceCatalyst was a community of people who were on a similar journey from a Christian background, still Jesus-centric, still, love Jesus and look to Jesus as our example and teaching of how we should relate to others, but less confrontational, trying to be accommodating of the other, not only respectful, but learn from the other as we walk together. So that was 2011 that I became a part of PeaceCatalyst. And I was based in Louisville, so I was doing all I could there to connect with the different mosques that are in Louisville. There were 17, 19 mosques in Louisville. They don't all have imams, or at least that many places of prayer. I don't know that they would all technically be considered a mosque, but became good friends with a few of the imams there. The River Road Mosque and the Westport Road Mosque are two that I spend a lot of time with. Imam Al-Mutem is a Syrian man that's at the Westport Road Mosque. And as we became friends and talked more and more, I was able to get him on the stage of a Northeast Christian church in Louisville, which is, I think they're about a 3,000 member congregation. And I helped the pastor write questions to ask the imam. So PeaceCatalyst, peacemakers many times stand in between two communities that don't understand each other. And we're saying there's good in this side and there's good in that side. And you know, in many conflicts, when you try to take a middle ground, both sides get mad at you. So you know, there's been some of that. You know, you're not loyal to the group. Maybe we see it more in politics, in racial conversations. But peacemakers stand in between groups that are at odds and look for the good in the other and try to amplify that message. A lot of what we do is based on contact theory. So it's the idea that we're so isolated from each other. We don't spend time together. So contact theory says that if you can bring people together, they'll realize some of the biases that they have and begin to question those. And if it's a positive experience, then we can move the relationships into a more healthy space. But there are problems with contact theory. Sometimes you bring people together and it just reinforces the stereotypes. Sometimes you introduce information to people and they just double down. It's like they don't care if your facts are better than their facts. And we can get bogged down in trying to argue about facts when really it's more about the heart. You know, we've got to somehow move from debating facts with each other to caring about each other. And that's what happened to me when I moved to Cyprus. My best friends were Palestinian men, fellow students of mine. I was working on a master's in international relations. And these Palestinian friends, I was testing out the things that I had learned in books. But when we became friends, I could ask them questions to clarify my thinking. But you can't do that apart from a relationship. So how do we build the relationship? If I just drop into the mosque and start asking questions, it can be perceived as, well, who's this guy? You know, why is he here? And there's this tension that can only be overcome in relationship. So how do we build the relationships with each other? And PeaceCatalyst has tried many things through the years. When Rick passed away, the organization was 10 years old, and I stepped in as president of the organization. And it was a time to look back. What have we done in 10 years, and where do we want to go in the future? And what we did was we ended up, we had strictly been working on, excuse me, we had strictly been working on relationships between Muslims and Christians, but the national conversation in the US was also beginning to focus on racial tensions again in the conversation. I had one of our staff peoples in Minneapolis, and He was blocks away from where George Floyd was killed. So he became involved in those protests or expressions of exasperation. He's a white man, so how does he what's his posture in a space like that? Can we really understand what's going on? So he's asking questions like that, and our organization is moving more into racial conversation. Oh, look at that, you have a shelf to put it on. How nice. Excuse me. Is moving more into racial conversation, and we're wanting to give our staff space to do that. Another one of our staff was a missionary in Western China with the Uyghur people. Do you know the story of the Uyghurs? So the Uyghurs is the largest ethnic group that's being targeted for re-education, China's calling it, putting them in what we might call concentration camps, re-education camps. There have been parallels to what happened to the indigenous Americans here in the US, parallels to what happened in Germany with our Jewish friends. And it's happening in Western China now. So one of our staff is very passionate about the Uyghurs. In fact, he'll be in LA. He just sent me an email. I forget when, but a lot of those events they do online to advocate for the Uyghurs. So what's one way we can build trust with each other is advocating for the other when there are problems in that community. What are you more interested in? Are you more interested in like a theological framework of why we do this from a Jesus-centered perspective? And I want to get to the very practical things that we do also. Let me touch on the theology just for a few minutes. And I think we will share this with our Muslim friends, but PeaceCatalyst is primarily focused on helping Christians collaboratively cross lines of difference. So again, I come from conservative church backgrounds. Many times when you come to an interfaith gathering, the conservative church isn't in the room. And it's like, why is that? And there's a whole series of answers to that. But one of the functions of PeaceCatalyst is to invite the conservative churches into these spaces. And does that cause problems for the more progressive voices in the room? Sometimes it does. But I was looking at Acts 15. There's the story of the Jerusalem Council being held, and the story then was, or the conflict in the church then was, can Gentiles, can non-Jewish people be a part of the Christian community, the church, or do Gentile people have to convert to Judaism and then they can become Christian? So that was the debate that was going on. And in that debate, you had Paul and Barnabas advocating for, no, people don't have to become Jewish to follow Jesus. But then you had a group of people who were concerned about the integrity of their faith, concerned about what God had revealed in the Jewish scriptures about circumcision and that sort of thing. And they were trying to be true to their faith. Members of the Pharisees were there advocating, saying, no, if they're going to become Christian, or if they're going to become followers of Jesus, they must come through Judaism. So there's this big debate that's going on. And they decided in that debate that people didn't have to become Jewish first, But what I found interesting just a few months ago, as I was looking at that, was that they made concessions for these conservative people that were concerned. So they said, okay, they don't have to become Jewish, but please, when we get together and we have meals, let's not eat meat that was of animals that was strangled. And there were another thing or two that I'm not remembering right now, but there was an accommodation for the conservative voices that said, we've always done it this way. But there's also, they landed on inclusion, as being as inclusive as they could of others. So my point being is both the conservative and the progressive voices were there in that, and they accommodated everybody. So if we're going to move together in peace, that's another role I find myself standing in between the progressive churches and the conservative churches, saying we've got to figure out a way to work together. So the language that PeaceCatalyst has embraced is the language of shalom. So you think about, and my Muslim friends challenge me, why didn't you say salam? And it's like, okay, I got to choose one. But when we talk about shalom, we go back to Genesis 3, what theologians talk about the fall, that when sin came into the world. And to my Muslim friends, I apologize just a little bit, because I'm approaching this from a Christian perspective, but I'm trying to get Christians to be peace builders is primarily the focus of the word. So when we talk about what was lost from paradise, when Adam and Eve made their choices, the first few chapters of Genesis, what happened there? There was this harmony that was disrupted. Now, the churches that I grew up in have so focused on the relationship between God and mankind was broken. And we focused on Jesus came to restore this relationship is the Christian message. But other things were lost at that point in time. Not only was the relationship between God and man strained, broken, needing repair, but the relationship between men and women was altered at that time. More broadly, mankind was altered at that time. Relationship with nature was altered at that time. You get one generation in, you have Cain killing Abel over a religious dispute. My sacrifice is better than your sacrifice. No, it's not, and somebody ends up dead. Then you have Cain moving to a city and building a city to protect him and his family to the exclusion of others, hoarding resources, saying, this is for me, not for you. And the harmony that God had set up in the beginning, the ideal picture of Eden, of paradise, was lost. And we believe in PeaceCatalyst, we teach that shalom, the pursuit of shalom, is the restoration of all things, a mutual thriving of all of us. How do we work together toward this thriving? So Jesus comes to his hometown in Nazareth in Luke 4 and says, I've come to preach good news for the poor, to give sight to the blind, freedom to the prisoner, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, which is a reference to Jubilee. So what happened in the year of Jubilee? It was an economic reset. Slaves were set free. Money was, or financial resources were redistributed. Jesus said it begins now. And when he made it clear in Luke 4 that he wasn't just talking about for his synagogue there in Nazareth, not just for the Jewish people, it made them so angry they tried to kill him. So sometimes our messages of inclusion cause problems for our own religious community. Well, I can talk theology and with Christians all day, finding different examples of how God broke through the barriers between people, Jesus taking his disciples to Samaritan villages and taking his disciples to Gentile areas. The vision that Peter had with Cornelius to go to Cornelius's house. And I love that passage in, I think it's Acts 10, where Peter goes to Cornelius's house, who's a Gentile. And he's had this vision, and when he walks in, he says, now you know it's illegal for me to be here. Now think about that. The structure had become illegal for people to associate with each other. And God intervened in a way that broke those barriers between others. So those are some of the things, those are some of the lines of reasoning that we would talk to our Christian friends about, to advocate for peace, to advocate for shalom. When we did that 10-year review, one of the phrases that we came up with was the idea of, or it's a pathway that we think of. We help people understand the other. And that's what you're doing here. You're coming together to understand the other, to indicate that you are open to relationship across the Muslim, Christian, well, there's a divide. Across that divide, you are open to something more. You long for something more. You long for peace, for thriving of all. But we talk about understanding, but then we talked about connecting. And you're doing some of the connecting here, but I want to give you some ideas and challenge you to be more intentional about the connecting with the other. And then the third word we use is collaborate. So understand, connect, and collaborate. So I can go into a church and tell people, here are stories about my Muslim friends, and here's what I understand about Islam. And I'll do the best I can to represent Islam accurately. But I'm not Muslim. I didn't grow up in a Muslim majority country. And even though I try my very best, I may misrepresent. And Islam with 1.3 or 4 billion people, there are different expressions of Islam too. So to say Muslims think X is an overly simplistic statement. Part of peacemaking is to complicate the narrative. And we do that by saying, some of the things that, you think you can put on a bumper sticker, you need a book to explain. It's just more complicated than that. Sometimes we come together and, well, we've done this many times where, our Muslim friends want to explain, the 5 pillars of Islam and the beauty of Muhammad and the beauty of the Quran. And sometimes we stay at an intellectual level, but we've got to move it to the heart. Now, here are some of the things that PeaceCatalyst has done to help move it to the heart. There was a campus group that helped international students at the University of Louisville called Oasis, and I began volunteering there. And there were Muslim students there, Fulbright students, some of them, and we would go to the airport and collect them and help them find apartments and help them find furniture as they studied. And then on holidays, when all the American students are going back to their homes to have Thanksgiving meals or Christmas dinners, and the campus shuts down for 2 weeks over New Year's and Christmas, we would invite them into our homes and try to be a family for these international students. And the love we received from that, from these students, the appreciation that we received from that were heartwarming, and it began to move it, from the head to the heart. We began in my home. We began to do a Bible reading with our Muslim friends. So we started doing. My wife and I for 10 years or so, had to break for COVID, have been doing we fix a halal breakfast at our house, to the best of our ability, which it simply means no pork and no alcohol. And if we were, well, we do eggs. So, but we invite our Muslim friends into a time where we share a meal, and then we'll sit down and just read through. Right now, we're working our way through Luke together. And sometimes my Christian friends think that I'm trying to convert Muslims as I'm doing this reading, and we're really not. It's not a transactional thing where we're trying to get Muslims to leave their expressions of faith and join our expressions of faith. It's more of a curiosity of why is American culture that's been so influenced by Christianity, how has it become like this? The passages, what are the differences between what Jesus said and what the church is doing? Those are questions that come up. There are passages in the Quran that reference, for example, Yahya is John the Baptist. It mentions John the Baptist, but there's more detail in the Injil and in the gospel accounts. So those things are interesting. How does Jesus deal with his disciples? He had disciples that were tax collectors and zealots in the same group. How did Jesus deal with power differentials? Remember the story? There's a story. Oh, where's the passage? It doesn't matter. You'll remember the story. Jairus, synagogue leader, comes to Jesus and says, "My little girl's sick. Would you come heal her?" And he's on his way to heal Jairus's daughter. And this woman with an issue of blood, it comes up and touches Jesus secretly, and she's healed. So Jesus is going through the town with a man who came to him with a reasonable expectation that Jesus would respond, would help him. And then you have the woman who came up, sneaked up, because she would have made Jesus ceremonially unclean, is one part of that, but didn't want to be noticed, hoping she could get something from Jesus. And just the power differentials there. And Jesus affirms the woman's faith. And when Jairus' servants come and say, "Don't bother Jesus anymore, your little girl's dead," Jesus turns to Jairus and says, "Have faith." And then the implication is like this woman. So, Jesus is constantly elevating women, elevating the marginalized. So those are fascinating things to touch on as we read through the Gospels with our Muslim friends. So they will many times say, "Well, Muhammad said X, Y, or Z," or they'll quote one of the hadiths or part of the Quran. I have some Turkish friends that like to quote Rumi or Hafez, the mystic poets. So all of that is welcome in the room. And we just go to the next verses next time we get together. So it's not like I have this line of logic, of reasoning that I'm trying to guide people through. to use Christian terminology. We're counting on the Holy Spirit to just guide the conversation. We're counting on God to guide the conversation in productive ways as we respond to each other with love and respect. So that's one thing that we do. We do the peace feast. Let me tell you about the peace feast. Okay, so we do the peace feast because Lisa and Addison are talking about doing one here for you. Let me tell you about one of the more successful ones we had in Louisville. We'll go to an ethnic restaurant in Louisville. This group, I was working with the Pakistanis at this point in time. In Louisville, we had the Pakistani, at that time, it was the Pakistani Physicians Association. Muhammad Babar Chima, he's a doctor in Louisville, started Muslim Americans for Compassion out of that group. But Dr. Babar and I were working together on this peace feast. And what I'll typically do is I will work with the ethnic group, in this case Pakistanis, and say, what questions would you like me to ask at the peace feast? Because I'm trying to tee up the ball, so to speak, so that our Pakistani friends can share their story. We started out by having somebody show up and lecture like me, you know, and lecturing to you. I'm sorry, the next hour will be conversation. But we found that if the person was exceptionally boring, it could kill the event. Yeah. So sometimes it was good and sometimes it wasn't. What we found to be better was, in this case, I'm working with the Pakistani community and said, bring as many Pakistani people as you can. And we would put Christians and Pakistanis at the different tables in the room. And we would work on questions ahead of time that I would ask the group. And I would, in this case, this was a unique event because the World Affairs Council in Louisville had brought a group of Pakistani journalists through Louisville that night, and they attended our Pakistani peace feast. So we had 80 people in the room that night at an Indian restaurant, because there's not a Pakistani restaurant. And I asked questions. The first question I asked that night was about colonialism. As a Pakistani man, tell me about, or as a Pakistani person, tell me how colonialism has affected your country. And I remember an American turning his head and looking at me like, what are you talking about? But one of the Pakistani journalists was in tears by the time he'd finished answering that question. He said, for 400 years, we've been in servitude to somebody, and it has affected the way that people, especially in the rural areas that don't have contact with the outside world, think about things. And our country is paying the price of this subjugation for centuries. The most edgy question I asked that night was about drone warfare. It doesn't always get that heavy at these events, but this was a unique event. So I asked, the Pakistan, we're interested in drone warfare because we hear that the Pakistani people are very upset by innocent people being killed by drones. But we also hear that the Pakistani government kind of likes the US drones because they kill people they don't want to deal with, and they get to blame America for it. So as a Pakistani journalist who deals with this stuff all the time, explain to your table the effect of drone warfare in your country. So again, complicating the narrative. That night, there was one of the women Pakistani journalists, I think she was Hindu, maybe she was Muslim. I know I had Hindu journalists there that night. Bristled when she realized that there was a U.S. military guy sitting at the table with her. So, she too comes with stereotypes. And this guy, I happen to know him pretty well, had flat feet and never got past the private stage, of being in the military. It wasn't like he was making any decisions about anything. But by the end of the evening, they were standing next to each other, getting their photos taken to share on social media. But we always ask questions too about family. If we hear Arab hospitality is just famous. So if I were to come to visit your country and there was a holiday coming on, so you always know when the holidays are, and I was to go to your house, what would we do? How would first of all, who's in your house? Is it like multiple generations? How would your mother treat me? Do I have to take off my shoes when I come in? Would she and families are different. You can't just say, oh, Arab families treat people like this. Some families, the mom's all business and, it's like, take care of yourself. And other places it's, you become an adopted son in those places. So to show the nuance of change in different cultures is important to what we do. So the Peace Feast have been a great event. They built trust between the Muslim and Christian community in Louisville. So we've done Peace Feast with, first one was a Palestinian Peace Feast. I think we had 13 at that one. We've done multiple Palestinian, we've done multiple Turkish Peace Feasts, Syrian, Kurdish, Iraqi. I don't know. They run together through the years. And I don't know what the foreign-born population is in Lexington. I don't know if you have enough to do that with, but some of the lessons we learned was don't have a speaker stand up and talk to everybody, have conversations at the tables. There's all types of tips I have about working with the restaurant. You don't want everybody to order off the menu because you'll overwhelm the kitchen. You need a set price, stuff like that. Another thing that we've done is travel. We have one family. We're in 15 cities around the U.S. We have a couple in Sarajevo, Bosnia, a couple in Indonesia, a couple in England, Norwich, England. As any of you know, Julian of Norwich, we have a couple that's in that town. I have a young lady that's joining us that's in South Korea that's focused on the relationship between North and South Korea. Last year, we took a group of students from Notre Dame University, political science students, to Bosnia. And we went to Bosnia to learn from the peacemakers there. Now, Bosnia, of course, was part of Yugoslavia. When it broke up, the Serbs got the weapons of the Yugoslav army. But you had three distinct ethnic groups there that also broke along religious lines. So you had the Serbian Orthodox, you had the Bosniak Muslims, and you had the Croatian Catholics. But all of them were in the country of Bosnia. And of course, in the 90s, that broke into war, broke into genocide. So, we visited the city of Srebrenica, and we looked at the UN compound that was overrun by the Serbian army, where they, killed 8,000 people. They came in and, raped the women and killed the young men, and they tried to run through the mountains where there were landmines and snipers, and you hear this story of the UN's failure to protect, and it raises questions. Well, should there be an international like police force with power? And so those are conversations that get provoked in a space like that. But interestingly, the Sephardic Jews were able to remain neutral in that conflict, in that war. How are they able to do that? The Franciscan Catholic Church distanced itself a little bit from the Croatian Catholic community and were able to remain somewhat neutral in that conflict. But after genocide, how do you put a country back together? How do you rebuild trust? So we took these students there, and you're looking at it in the third person. It's like, here's what happened over there. But as we're talking to these people, they are warning us as they look at the U.S. news. One man who'd been in the Yugoslav army, he'd been a general, I think, said, if you had told me 5 years before the war in Bosnia that we would disintegrate into civil war, so at first I would have laughed at how ridiculous it was. Then I would have been offended, because our communities lived together. We knew each other. We went to school together. But 5 years later, it became the war that it was. And this man said, as I look at the U.S. and the rhetoric in the U.S., I see you on the same trajectory. It was sobering for and these students from Notre Dame, you know, they will be in DC and in lawyers' offices. You know, these are really bright students. Another thing we found was that the students from Notre Dame could ask the impolite questions. We had briefed them thoroughly before we took them, and they knew a lot of the history. But you know how if you're in a room with somebody that you know disagrees with you, you kind of know what to say and what not to say. These students could ask the impolite question, and we had paired them with students from Bosnia. So there were Bosniak Muslims, there were Croatian Catholics, and Serbian Orthodox students with these Notre Dame students. And the students from Bosnia knew what not to ask of the other side, but the Notre Dame students had kind of pushed through that. So looking at things in the third person is another way to build relationships.
Do you have other faiths that you're interacting with? A lot of your focus today is obviously on Christian-Muslim relationships.
We do. We were born in a post 9/11 environment, and that's sort of the ethos of that we come to work with. But our Jewish friends have participated in many of our events. We've done, interestingly, I tried to set up a Iranian peace feast. So I went to I never can remember the name of the restaurant. I went to a restaurant, and it wasn't owned by Muslims like I was expecting. It was owned by Baha'i. So we ended up working with the Baha'i community on an Iranian peace feast. So yeah, we're open to that. But our mission statement is helping Christians collaboratively cross lines of difference. So we realize that in a sense, it kind of feels like we're using our Muslim friends in a sense, because we're using them to provoke the Christian community to think differently. So we as PeaceCatalyst staff, we as peacemakers will go and we have friends in all of these communities, and we're inviting our Christian friends to come join us in these relationships.
What theologians and writers influence PeaceCatalyst?
Miroslav Volf was significant at the beginning. As I look at what we're reading now, Richard Rohr has been influential in many journeys. The book Falling Upward was talking about 2 stages of life where you need strong containers. You know, religion can be a positive influence. It doesn't have to be destructive, but it can be if we're not careful, if we confuse our need for security with our faith, and start isolating ourselves from others, and it can morph into justification of hurting others because we see them as destructive to the overall. So we have to find a way to work together. Authors, sorry, I got distracted. There's a professor at Pepperdine University, John Barton, that has just released a book in the last couple of months, Better Religion. And he's talking about how to, well, Volf talked about thick and thin religion, but he's talking about how to, the different faith groups can work together in a healthy way. So John Barton. I like Brian McLaren. We've interviewed some of these people on our we have a podcast. I would encourage you to go to our website, kind of poke around there. The podcast, we interviewed several people. There's a man, Peter Coleman, he's a professor at Columbia University in New York, talking about neuroscience and why and toxic polarization and why is it that we're psychologically wired to divide and protect ourselves. I've listened to this book like 3 times, was listening to it on the way down here. Peter Coleman, here I have it right now in Audible. I can tell you the way out, how to overcome toxic polarization. So we're trying to tap into neuroscience too. We wrote a grant for to do a program to use the arts and neuroscience to address polarization. And the idea is if you can produce cognitive dissonance in a person, make them realize that what they're saying and the way they're acting are inconsistent. We're hardwired to resolve that because we don't want to be perceived as hypocritical. So if you can show someone they talk, love your neighbor, but really they're being hateful to their neighbor, then they're hardwired to resolve that. I mean, they can go 2 different ways. They can either double down, or if you can give them a positive off ramp, a face-saving off ramp. See, we tend to want to shame people for what we think is bad about their behavior, but that never works. You've got to give them a face-saving way to participate in a healthy way, and things like a peace feast is a low bar. Come have dinner with somebody. Come listen to their story. Coleman talked. I think it was Coleman. I've listened to so many things. Talked about the power differentials when you're hearing somebody's story, perspective giving and perspective taking. If the person with power will be more inclined to receive the other if they will be quiet and listen. The person without power will be more likely to pursue harmony if they are allowed to tell their story and they believe they've been heard. So you need to, the person with power needs to reflect back what they're hearing. So, these are like techniques that you can do in a room, but Coleman talks about some of those things. I think you would find some of it interesting. Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think that goes to power dynamics. So like if you were to look in the US, the Muslim population is 2 to 3% of the total population. And the Muslim population is very open to relationship with those in power. I'm approaching this from a sociological perspective right now. If I were in Pakistan, the dynamics are reversed. The Christian population is, 1 or 2%. I don't know the percentage, but it's very low in Pakistan. And the people who hold the power is the Muslim population. So really, whoever is in power is empowered to invite the other to share and participate. So it's important for the Christian community who holds more power to invite the minority voices to participate in the US. If we're in a Muslim majority country, it's important for the majority to invite the minority. So when we talk about religious freedom, I'm going to DC this week for International Religious Freedom Summit. Religious freedom doesn't mean I get to do what I want to do and forget everybody else. A tenet is to be inclusive, allow everyone to. We live in a pluralistic society, so how can we thrive together? So which group is more accommodating partly depends on what part of the world we're in. It changes from country to country. Another thing, I was talking earlier, and this is another Peter Coleman idea. We tend to look at problems like clocks. He talks about clock problems and cloud problems. And a clock problem is, okay, this gear isn't quite right. If I can fix this one thing, then we can have harmony and the clock will tell the right time. And he said some of these issues that we face are more like a swarm of gnats. You run your hand through it, and there's so many factors at play. And again, that goes back to trying to complicate the narrative. To say, okay, does Christianity or Islam push for peace more? Is a dualistic way of looking at a problem is kind of a clock sort of thing, instead of, well, there are power dynamics at play, there's political stuff at play, there's migration issues at play, there's environmental issues at play, there's poverty issues at play that make people act in different ways. So it's not like there's not a button we can push to fix this. This is work but we have to be in relationship. Like the Imam was saying, his relationship with the pastor allows him and the pastor to have better conversations than I'm going to have if I just, well, the worst thing you can do is just read a book about the other. Or do a Google search. There's no telling what's going to come up. We have to get to relation. We have to get to the love and compassion that the Imam was speaking about. When the River Road Mosque was vandalized in Louisville, 1,000 people showed up to paint over that graffiti on the mosque. The Christian community in the States has more power than the Muslim community. We need to step up and be there when things happen, and it becomes reciprocal. A Pakistani friend wrote about 1,000 people showing up when the mosque at River Road was vandalized, and it was published in the largest online newspaper in Pakistan. And he said, in Louisville, when our mosque was vandalized, 1,000 people showed up to show solidarity. Would we have done the same thing if a church had been vandalized in Pakistan? So what you do in Lexington can have ripple effects around the world. What we did in Louisville allowed this Pakistani man to challenge his community to be more pluralistic, accepting. to pursue harmony and love.
In John 15, Jesus talks about fruit that will last. Is peace building, is peace a lasting fruit?
I think it's the heart of God. And so if God is lasting, peace should be lasting. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. So he obviously endorsed peace making. Today we use different terms. We talk about peacemaking, peace keeping, and peace building. And they're slightly different things. Peacemaking, I think a lot of people, when you say, okay, be a peacemaker, are picturing themselves going in breaking up fights in bars. It's like peacemaking is trying to get people to stop shooting at each other, trying to get people to there's active conflict and you're trying to stop the pain. That's peacemaking. Peacekeeping is a treaty has been signed and is everybody living up to the agreements that we have. Now, sometimes the agreements aren't good. I was reading a book last week. A Black woman had written to white peacemakers. And she was using the term peacekeeping in a negative sense, because sometimes, we have a cultural contract and nobody wants to, ruffle the feathers, make waves, choose your metaphor. And the minority people get hurt in the peacekeeping unless the agreement is good. Our founder, Rick Love, said sometimes you have to break peace to make peace. Sometimes the structural system is broken and you have to make people uncomfortable before they're willing to step into the conflict and question themselves and make the changes. Let me do the third one first. Peace building is what I think I see Jesus doing primarily. He's taking his disciples to meet the other. He's challenging them. He's challenging the social structures. Remember when he cleared the temple and people say, oh, Jesus was violent. He makes a whip and he drives the animals out according to the Injil, according to, the gospel accounts. But he was clearing the courts of the Gentiles and the women. So the things that had been made to accommodate the other in the Jewish system were being compromised. And Jesus says, get these things out of here. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. So Jesus was challenging the systems. He was challenging his disciples to build peace. Can you imagine what the disciples must have felt when he said, we're going to go to this Samaritan village? You can feel the tension in their stomach, And then he talks to the Samaritan woman at the well, and the disciples come back and he says, I think we're going to stay here for a few days. Some people have looked at him crossing the sea. Remember, he crosses the sea to go to the region of the Gerasenes, Mark 5, I think. And there's this big storm that comes up and Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat and the disciples are like, we're going to drown. Some people have said, Mark, put that story in that order to illustrate the storm going on in the hearts of the disciples. We're going to go where? Gentile pig farmers live over there. That must have stretched the Jewish disciples just a little bit.
Did Jesus come to bring peace or a sword?
Oh, gee. Okay, so now we're in Matthew 10. Great passage. I had went part of my losing support That was part of it. Jesus didn't come to bring peace. He came to bring the sword. But if you read that in context, it's the limited commission. He's sending the disciples out. And interestingly, he says there, don't go to the towns of the Samaritans or the Gentiles, but go to the house of Israel. Go to the Jewish, go to the synagogues, go to your own people, your own tribe. And he says, when you do that, look for the person of peace. So go to your own group and look for the people who want to be peacemakers and stay with them. Build on that. But this is going to turn father against son, mother, wife against her mother-in-law. You know, that's in the same passage. And he says, I've come to bring, this is going to be like a sword. Some people aren't going to be able to accept this. To advocate for peace, to advocate for unity among your own people is going to cause conflict. It's not that you're supposed to intentionally poke your finger in the eye of the person next to you. But people have a hard time accepting this. I referenced earlier Luke 4. You know, he goes to his hometown and they try to throw him off a cliff. That's kind of like, it's not a literal sword, but peacemaking can be painful because we said before, you're standing in between two communities and neither one considers you loyal to themselves because you're pointing out the good, you're complicating the argument. And
I was just thinking of what's currently happening about police reform. When you talked about peacekeeping, and that sometimes the agreements are not good, and not ruffling feathers becomes a high priority.
Right.
And I feel like that's what we're facing right now in the obvious need for police reform.
Yeah.
At the same time, the desire to not be anti-police or to disregard the value of the work that they provide for us.
Right.
And the immense pain that's taking place because we're not addressing it.
Right.
And so that sort of keeping the peace. And for me, that's a very clear example that brings your idea to life.
It's a great example.
Because it's so, it's happening right this moment, but it's also the pain of it is right this moment. And so it's so very clear that that is a dysfunctional model. Sometimes just keeping the peace is just not the right thing to do.
Well, and the treaties that are signed, like let's say a war treaty, you know, let's stop shooting at each other till we sort things out. The treaty is easily fractured because nobody trusts each other. So, you know, you have laws in place to say, okay, you stay here, you stay here. And if anybody violates that, the people who are afraid and are trying to protect themselves are saying, see, they're not keeping the treaty. And, you know, there is a treaty, so to speak, between the police and the neighborhoods, you know, protect the neighborhoods. Well, that's not happening for some of the neighborhoods. So that the treaty's not being held up. It needs to be reworked. But the treaty isn't the end. The peace building, the shalom is the trust, the love of neighbor that Jesus talked about is the end. Well, right now that the trust has been so fractured, we need a new treaty, a new way of peacemaking. But the peace builder says, look, there are good policemen that have literally laid their lives on the line to protect people. There are bad policemen that have let the power go to their head that just shouldn't be a policeman. But to even nuance it that much sometimes angers this side, you know. So So yeah, it's that swarm of gnats, you know, it's like, okay, that one's bad. Let's get rid of that one, but there's 1,000 others. So we have to just keep working and to be in relationship, to understand the pain of the Black community right now. I don't have, the church I attend was a merger of a Black church and a white church. We've been at this for 7 years of this merger, and it's been painful because there's things I don't understand. I approach problems from a different perspective, but we have to be in relationship with each other before it's going to get better, to be able to understand. Yeah. But thanks for that example. It's a good example. No, the first one I did came about because I was at the university with international students. So I had these good friends that were Palestinian, and I wanted to do a Palestinian peace feast to raise awareness of what's it like to be a Palestinian. So I found a Palestinian-owned restaurant, went all by myself to meet the owner of the restaurant, Sammy. He's still a good friend of mine. And he come to find out, he owned a restaurant prep business in Jerusalem, where he would cut up tomatoes and cucumbers and deliver them to all the little kiosks that, you know, made kebabs and stuff. And then something would happen in the city, some security thing, and the city would shut down, and he couldn't deliver his product. And that happened enough times that he went out of business. So I think, well, that's a fascinating story. Would you mind telling that story at our peace feast? And he didn't want to, or he didn't want to talk. At that point in time, I was looking for speakers. He didn't want to talk, but it was a blessing because that's where I learned the power of having table conversations. So I said, well, would you be willing to answer a couple of questions? He said, yeah, I can answer questions. So he came out to the table after he fixed the meal, and he sits down and said, okay, here's a question. What's it like to own a restaurant in Jerusalem? And with that, he's off. And he could have talked the whole night. But no, it got started because I intentionally went to a restaurant and said, I want to bring you business. What's your slowest night of business? Tuesday night, great. I'm gonna get as many people as I can to come to your restaurant on Tuesday night. But I had to do a sign-up sheet because, you know, the difference in preparing meal for 10 people versus 80 people, you know, I got to know about how many people are coming so he can prepare. And then I invited some of my Muslim friends that I had met at the student association to come. Or I go to the mosque frequently on Fridays and participate in the Friday prayers with them. So I have friends there, the Turkish community. And now I have enough trust and enough friends in the Muslim community. I can announce an event like this. I think the last one we did was a Iranian peace feast. And the Iranian community, the Muslim community spreads the word amongst themselves, and they come. We were at Ramsey's restaurant for that one, and he only had 50 seats. I was turning people away for that event. I write the question, I mean, I've been doing this long enough. I kind of know some questions that I think would be interesting, but I always go to the guest group, Iranian, Pakistani, whatever, and say, what questions would you like me to ask? Always a couple of personalizing questions to humanize people. You know, if I came to your house on a holiday, what would your mom be doing for me? Always a religious question. You know, okay, Syria is a Muslim country. But like in the US, we say we're a Christian country, but there's a lot of people that don't go to church, their faith is thin. How would you describe the religious situation in Syria? So I always let them, because I want them to share. What I don't want to do is hear again and again, well, here are the 5 pillars of faith. I don't want to keep going over that same ground. That's why I kind of orchestrate the questions ahead of time. I would love to pay for their meals, but I don't have the budget for that. We take up, I usually do an Eventbrite thing so people can sign up for it. I usually ask the restaurant to have a set meal or a buffet, and the restaurant will give me a price. Has been between $12 and $18. So they come and pay for their own. I usually, in Eventbrite, I'll set up a scholarship thing for like students or people who can't pay for it. If you could pay for somebody else, that's appreciated. With a group of 60 people, I'll get probably 4 to 7 scholarships out of that.